400 years later, is it time to settle the debt? The question of reparations for slavery has become one of the most heated debates in modern America. Some call it long overdue justice. Others say it's impossible to implement fairly. But to understand this debate, we need to go back to where it all began. In 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia. What started as a small number of people forced into bondage would grow into a massive system that shaped America's economy for over 200 years. By 1860, nearly 4 million people were enslaved across the United States. These weren't just numbers on a page. These were human beings who built much of America's early wealth with their unpaid labor. The enslaved people cleared forests, planted crops, built houses, and created the infrastructure that allowed the young nation to grow. Cotton alone, grown primarily by enslaved labor, made up over half of all American exports by the 1850s. The wealth generated by this forced labor didn't just benefit individual slave owners. It flowed through the entire economy, funding banks, shipping companies, textile mills, and even universities. Harvard, Yale, and other prestigious institutions received donations from slave trading families and invested their endowments in slave-produced goods. When slavery finally ended in 1865, the newly freed people owned almost nothing. They had no land, little education, and few resources to build new lives. Meanwhile, their former owners often kept the wealth that had been built on unpaid labor. This wasn't just an economic gap. It was a chasm that would define American society for generations to come. The total value of enslaved people in 1860 was estimated at over $3 billion, equivalent to hundreds of billions in today's money. All of that human capital was freed without compensation to the people who had been treated as property. After the Civil War, there was a brief moment when real change seemed possible. During Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1877, the federal government tried to help formerly enslaved people build new lives. Some freed people received small plots of land through the Freedmen's Bureau. Black men gained the right to vote through the 15th Amendment. African Americans were elected to Congress and state legislatures for the first time in American history. Schools were built for black children who had been denied education under slavery. But this progress didn't last. In 1877, federal troops were withdrawn from the South as part of a political deal to resolve the disputed presidential election. Without federal protection, Southern states quickly began rolling back the rights of African Americans. They passed Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation in every aspect of daily life. They used violence and intimidation through groups like the Ku Klux Klan to prevent black people from voting. They created a system of sharecropping that kept many African Americans in poverty, often working the same land they had worked as slaves but now paying rent to their former masters. The promise of 40 acres and a mule that some freed people had been given was largely broken. Most of the land that had been distributed was taken back and returned to white owners under President Andrew Johnson's lenient Reconstruction policies. This meant that most African Americans entered the 20th century with little wealth to pass down to their children, while white families continued to accumulate property and resources. From the 1880s to the 1960s, Jim Crow laws created a system of legal segregation across much of the United States. These laws didn't just separate the races. They systematically denied African Americans access to good jobs, quality education, and opportunities to build wealth. Black workers were excluded from most unions and confined to low-paying occupations. Black children attended underfunded schools with outdated textbooks and inadequate facilities. Black families were forced to live in overcrowded neighborhoods with poor housing and limited services. During this same period, the federal government was helping white Americans build wealth through programs that largely excluded black people. The Homestead Act gave away millions of acres of land to white settlers in the West. Between 1862 and 1934, the government distributed 270 million acres of land, worth billions of dollars today. Very few black families received homestead land due to discrimination and the practical difficulties of traveling to and settling in the Western territories. The New Deal programs of the 1930s provided crucial support to American families during the Great Depression, but many of these programs excluded agricultural and domestic workers, occupations that employed most African Americans at the time. Social Security initially excluded these same workers, meaning that black Americans contributed to the economic recovery without receiving equal benefits. The GI Bill after World War II helped millions of white veterans buy homes and go to college, creating the foundation of the white middle class. But discriminatory practices meant that black veterans received far fewer benefits. Southern universities refused to admit black students, forcing them to attend overcrowded historically black institutions that lacked adequate resources. Banks refused to provide mortgages to black veterans, and real estate agents steered them away from white neighborhoods. The Federal Housing Administration, created in the 1930s, helped millions of white families buy homes through government-backed loans. But the agency refused to back loans in neighborhoods with black residents. This practice, called redlining, meant that black families were largely shut out of homeownership during the period when housing values were rising most rapidly. Government appraisers were instructed to give low ratings to neighborhoods with black residents, making it nearly impossible for black families to get mortgages even when they had good credit and steady incomes. These policies had lasting effects that compounded over generations. Homeownership became the primary way that American families built wealth, as property values increased and mortgage payments built equity. Because black families were systematically excluded from this opportunity, the racial wealth gap continued to grow. By the 1960s, when the civil rights movement was fighting to end legal segregation, this gap had become enormous and would prove extremely difficult to close. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s won important legal victories that transformed American society. The Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954 declared school segregation unconstitutional. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination in public places and employment. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected the right to vote and sent federal registrars to southern states to ensure black Americans could exercise this right. Fair housing laws in 1968 banned discrimination in housing sales and rentals. But even as legal barriers fell, the economic effects of centuries of discrimination remained deeply embedded in American society. The wealth gap between black and white families didn't disappear with the end of legal segregation. In fact, in some ways it continued to grow as the economy became more complex and wealth became increasingly important for accessing opportunities. Studies show that the typical white family today has about 10 times the wealth of the typical black family. This gap exists at every income level and affects access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunity. Some of this ongoing gap reflects continuing discrimination that persists despite civil rights laws. Studies have consistently shown that job applicants with white-sounding names like Brad and Emily are more likely to get callbacks than those with black-sounding names like Deshaun and Lakeisha, even when their qualifications are identical. Black homebuyers are still more likely to be denied mortgages than white applicants with similar credit scores and income levels. Black borrowers who do receive loans often pay higher interest rates than white borrowers with similar financial profiles. But much of the wealth gap reflects the compound effects of past discrimination that built up over generations. Wealth accumulates over time through homeownership, business ownership, and investments. Families that were prevented from buying homes in the 1940s and 1950s couldn't pass that wealth to their children through inheritance. Those children had less money for college tuition, less money for down payments on homes, and less financial security to take risks like starting businesses. This pattern repeated across generations, creating a cumulative disadvantage that persists even when current discrimination is reduced. The typical white family has enough wealth to survive without income for about 75 days, while the typical black family can survive for only about 10 days. This wealth gap affects every aspect of life, from the ability to help children pay for college to the capacity to weather economic downturns. It influences where families can afford to live, which schools their children attend, and what opportunities they can pursue. Supporters of reparations argue that the United States has a moral and legal obligation to address the ongoing effects of slavery and discrimination. They point out that other groups have received reparations for historical injustices, establishing precedents for compensating victims of government-sanctioned wrongdoing. Japanese Americans received reparations for their internment during World War II through the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which provided $20,000 payments to surviving internees and a formal apology from the government. Germany paid extensive reparations to Holocaust survivors and to Israel as a state, totaling billions of dollars over several decades. Native American tribes have received various forms of compensation for land taken by the federal government, though many argue these payments have been inadequate given the scale of the losses. The Indian Claims Commission, which operated from 1946 to 1978, awarded over $800 million to tribes for land claims, though this represented only a fraction of the land's actual value. The economic argument for reparations is straightforward but powerful. Enslaved people provided centuries of unpaid labor that built much of America's early wealth. Their descendants were then systematically excluded from opportunities to build wealth through discriminatory laws and practices that persisted well into the modern era. The result is a massive wealth gap that affects millions of Americans today and limits their ability to invest in education, housing, and businesses that could benefit the broader economy. Reparations could help close this gap by providing resources for education, homeownership, business development, and other wealth-building activities. Economic studies suggest that reducing racial wealth gaps could boost overall economic growth by increasing consumption, entrepreneurship, and human capital development. When more families have resources to invest in their children's education and start new businesses, the entire economy benefits from increased productivity and innovation. Supporters also argue that reparations would benefit the entire country, not just African Americans, by creating a more educated workforce and more prosperous communities. Reducing racial inequality could help heal social divisions that have plagued America for generations and reduce the social costs associated with poverty and discrimination. Countries with lower levels of inequality tend to have higher levels of social trust, political stability, and economic growth. Some reparations advocates point to successful programs at the local level as evidence that such initiatives can work in practice. In 2019, Evanston, Illinois, became the first city to create a reparations program, initially focusing on housing assistance for Black residents who could demonstrate that their ancestors faced housing discrimination. The program provides up to $25,000 for home repairs, down payments, or closing costs, funded through a tax on recreational marijuana sales. Other cities have followed with their own programs. California created a reparations task force in 2020 to study the issue and make recommendations for state-level action. Several universities have acknowledged their historical connections to slavery and established funds to support Black students and communities. These examples show that reparations can work on a practical level and generate public support when designed carefully. Critics of reparations raise several significant objections that reflect both practical concerns and philosophical disagreements about the role of government in addressing historical injustices. The most common objection involves the practical challenges of implementation. How would the government decide who qualifies for reparations? Would it be based on ancestry, requiring people to prove their descent from enslaved Americans? Would it consider income levels, providing assistance only to those below certain thresholds? What about people with mixed ancestry who might be part African American and part other ethnicities? These questions become even more complex when considering recent African immigrants and their descendants. Should someone whose family immigrated from Nigeria in the 1980s receive reparations, even though their ancestors weren't enslaved in America? What about Black immigrants from the Caribbean whose ancestors were enslaved by European powers but not by the United States? These definitional challenges could make any reparations program extremely difficult to administer fairly. There are also fundamental questions about what form reparations should take. Should it be direct cash payments that people could use as they see fit? Tax credits that provide benefits over time? Investments in education and infrastructure that benefit Black communities broadly? Each approach has different advantages and disadvantages that affect both the program's effectiveness and its political feasibility. Direct cash payments might provide immediate relief and give recipients maximum flexibility in addressing their needs, but critics worry that one-time payments could be spent quickly without creating lasting wealth. Tax credits might be more politically palatable and provide ongoing benefits, but they would primarily help people with tax liability, potentially excluding the poorest families who might need help most. Community investments in education, healthcare, and infrastructure might have the most lasting impact on reducing inequality, but they wouldn't directly address individual wealth gaps and might benefit some Black families more than others depending on where they live. These programs might also be difficult to distinguish from general anti-poverty programs, raising questions about whether they constitute true reparations. Some critics argue that existing social programs already serve as a form of reparations for historical discrimination. They point to affirmative action in education and employment, minority business development programs, targeted healthcare initiatives, and social safety net programs that disproportionately benefit African Americans. From this perspective, additional reparations would be unnecessary and potentially unfair to other groups that have also faced discrimination. The cost question looms large in any discussion of reparations. Estimates for comprehensive reparations programs range from hundreds of billions to trillions of dollars, depending on their scope and structure. Some economists have calculated that the value of unpaid slave labor, compounded over time, could amount to several $1 trillion. Even more modest proposals for closing the racial wealth gap would cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Critics question whether taxpayers should bear this enormous cost, especially when many current taxpayers had no connection to slavery or Jim Crow discrimination. They argue that it's unfair to ask people whose families immigrated after slavery ended, or who have struggled economically themselves, to pay for something they had no role in creating. This fairness argument resonates particularly strongly with working-class white Americans who may feel that they haven't benefited from historical discrimination and shouldn't be held responsible for it. There are also concerns about the potential social and political consequences of reparations programs. Some critics worry that reparations could increase racial tensions rather than reduce them by creating resentment among other groups who feel overlooked or unfairly burdened. They argue that focusing on past injustices could make it harder to build a unified society that emphasizes shared values and common goals rather than historical grievances. These critics often prefer policies that help all low-income Americans rather than programs targeted at specific racial groups. They argue that universal programs like improved education funding, healthcare access, and job training would benefit Black Americans disproportionately while avoiding the divisiveness of race-specific policies. This approach might be more politically sustainable and could address some of the same problems that reparations are designed to solve. Looking at how other countries have handled similar situations provides useful context for understanding both the possibilities and limitations of reparations programs. South Africa's transition from apartheid offers one model, though the results have been mixed. The country established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that focused on documenting past abuses and promoting national healing, but it provided limited financial compensation to victims. South Africa also implemented various programs to address economic inequality, including Black economic empowerment policies that require companies to include Black South Africans in ownership and management positions. However, these programs have been criticized for primarily benefiting a small Black elite while leaving most Black South Africans in poverty. Nearly 3 decades after apartheid ended, South Africa remains one of the most unequal societies in the world. Germany's reparations to Holocaust survivors are often cited as a successful model, but that situation differed from American slavery in important ways. The Holocaust occurred over a much shorter time period, making it easier to identify victims and calculate damages. There were clearer records of who was affected and what they lost. The German government also made reparations payments to Israel as a state, not just to individuals, which simplified some administrative challenges. The payments to Japanese American internees represent the closest American precedent for reparations. This program was successful in providing compensation and acknowledgement to victims, but it involved a much smaller number of people and addressed a more recent and clearly documented injustice. The internment lasted only a few years during World War II, and there were government records identifying who had been detained and where. The political landscape around reparations has shifted dramatically in recent years, moving from a fringe idea supported mainly by activists to a topic of mainstream political discussion. Several Democratic presidential candidates in 2020 expressed support for studying reparations or implementing pilot programs. The House of Representatives has held multiple hearings on H.R. 40, a bill that would create a commission to study reparations proposals, though the bill has not yet been enacted into law. Public opinion polls show growing support for reparations among African Americans, with some surveys finding that more than 80% of Black Americans support some form of reparations. Support among white Americans remains much lower but has been increasing, particularly among younger white Americans and college-educated voters. This generational divide suggests that support for reparations may continue to grow as older, more conservative voters are replaced by younger, more liberal ones. However, significant political obstacles remain that make comprehensive reparations unlikely in the near term. Republicans generally oppose reparations as divisive and expensive, arguing that they would punish people who had no role in historical injustices. Even among Democrats, there are disagreements about what form reparations should take and whether they should be universal or targeted to specific income groups. The Supreme Court's recent decisions limiting affirmative action programs could also affect future reparations efforts. In cases like Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, the court has taken an increasingly narrow view of race-conscious government programs, ruling that they must meet strict constitutional standards to be permissible. If the court applies similar scrutiny to reparations programs, it might strike them down as violations of equal protection principles. This legal uncertainty makes politicians more cautious about supporting specific reparations proposals, even if they support the concept in general. Many prefer to support reparations commissions or study groups rather than concrete programs that might face legal challenges. This cautious approach reflects both genuine concerns about constitutional issues and political calculations about the electoral risks of supporting controversial policies. Economists have studied various reparations proposals and reached different conclusions about their likely effects on both recipients and the broader economy. Some research suggests that reparations could significantly reduce the racial wealth gap and boost economic growth by increasing Black families' ability to invest in education, housing, and businesses. Studies of existing wealth transfer programs, like the Earned Income Tax Credit, suggest that providing resources to low-wealth families can have positive long-term effects on children's educational outcomes and economic mobility. Proponents argue that African Americans have historically shown high rates of entrepreneurship when they have access to capital, suggesting that reparations could fund new businesses that create jobs and generate tax revenue. The success of Black-owned businesses during the Jim Crow era, despite severe restrictions and discrimination, demonstrates the potential for economic development when resources are available. Other economists are more skeptical about the potential benefits of reparations, arguing that simply providing money won't solve all the structural problems that contribute to racial inequality. Issues like educational disparities, discrimination in hiring and lending, residential segregation, and unequal access to social networks would persist even with reparations. These economists suggest that broader structural reforms might be more effective than reparations alone in addressing racial inequality. The question of program design remains crucial for determining effectiveness. Research on lottery winners and recipients of large settlements suggests that people who receive large lump sum payments don't always use them in ways that build long-term wealth. Some spend the money quickly on consumption rather than investment, while others make poor investment decisions that erode their gains over time. This research suggests that reparations programs might be more effective if they provide structured support for wealth-building activities rather than unrestricted cash payments. Programs that combine financial resources with financial education, business development support, and other services might produce better long-term outcomes than simple cash transfers. Beyond the economic and political questions, reparations raise important social and cultural issues that affect how different groups view the proposal. For many African Americans, reparations represent much more than just money. They represent acknowledgement of historical injustices and recognition of their ongoing effects. This symbolic value might be as important as any financial benefits in terms of promoting healing and reconciliation. The psychological effects of discrimination and disadvantage can persist across generations, affecting everything from educational achievement to health outcomes. Research has shown that experiencing discrimination can lead to chronic stress that contributes to higher rates of heart disease, diabetes, and other health problems in African American communities. Acknowledging these harms through reparations might help address some of these psychological and social effects. Some supporters argue that reparations could help heal racial divisions by forcing the country to confront its history honestly and take concrete steps to address ongoing inequality. They believe that avoiding difficult conversations about race and history has allowed problems to fester, and that honest acknowledgement of past wrongs is necessary for true reconciliation. Critics worry that reparations could have the opposite effect, creating resentment among other groups and reinforcing racial divisions rather than healing them. They argue that focusing on group differences rather than shared values could make social unity harder to achieve. Some worry that reparations could stigmatize Black Americans by reinforcing stereotypes about dependency on government assistance. There are also questions about how reparations would affect African American communities internally. Some worry that reparations could create divisions between those who qualify and those who don't, particularly if eligibility requirements are complex or exclusionary. Others argue that reparations could reduce incentives for self-improvement by making people dependent on government payments rather than encouraging individual effort and achievement. Not everyone who acknowledges the ongoing effects of slavery and discrimination supports traditional reparations in the form of cash payments or tax credits. Some advocates prefer alternative approaches that could address racial inequality without the complications of direct payments to individuals or the political challenges of race-specific programs. One popular alternative focuses on community investment rather than individual payments. This approach would direct resources toward historically Black institutions like colleges and universities, fund Black-owned businesses and community development projects, and invest in infrastructure improvements in predominantly Black neighborhoods. These programs could help build wealth in African American communities without raising difficult questions about individual eligibility or creating potential resentment among other groups. Educational initiatives represent another alternative approach that might be more politically feasible than direct reparations. This could include expanded funding for schools in low-income communities, free college tuition for first-generation college students, programs to reduce student loan debt, or support for historically black colleges and universities. Education has historically been one of the most effective ways to build wealth and reduce inequality across generations. Criminal justice reform represents another approach that could have effects similar to reparations while addressing broader social problems. The mass incarceration of African American men has devastated black communities and contributed significantly to the racial wealth gap by removing potential earners from families and creating barriers to employment for people with criminal records. Reforming drug laws, reducing mandatory minimum sentences, investing in rehabilitation programs, and removing barriers to employment for people with criminal records could help strengthen black families and communities. These reforms might be more politically popular than direct reparations because they would be framed as criminal justice issues rather than racial issues, even though they would disproportionately benefit African Americans. Some advocates support baby bonds, programs that would provide seed money for children from low-income families to use for education, homeownership, or starting businesses when they reach adulthood. These programs wouldn't be explicitly race-based, which might make them more politically feasible, but they would disproportionately benefit African American children because of higher poverty rates in black communities. The debate over reparations ultimately reflects deeper questions about American society and values that go far beyond any specific policy proposal. It forces Americans to grapple with difficult questions about collective responsibility, individual fairness, and the role of government in addressing historical injustices. It asks whether the United States is willing to take concrete steps to address the ongoing effects of its history of racial oppression, or whether it will continue to treat these problems as unfortunate legacies that don't require active intervention. Those who support reparations see them as necessary for achieving true equality and justice in American society. They argue that centuries of government-sanctioned discrimination created the current racial wealth gap, and only sustained government action can close it. They believe that America cannot move forward without addressing its past honestly and completely, and that reparations represent both practical necessity and moral imperative. Those who oppose reparations worry about their practical effects and fairness to other groups who have also faced challenges and discrimination. They argue that reparations could be divisive and expensive without solving the underlying cultural and structural problems that contribute to racial inequality. They prefer approaches that help all disadvantaged Americans rather than focusing on specific racial groups, and they worry about the precedent that reparations might set for other groups seeking compensation for historical injustices. The truth is that there are no simple answers to these complex questions. The legacy of slavery and discrimination is deeply embedded in American society in ways that affect everything from where people live to what schools their children attend to what opportunities they have to build wealth. Any solution will involve difficult trade-offs between competing values and unintended consequences that are difficult to predict. The challenge is finding approaches that can make meaningful progress toward racial equality while maintaining social cohesion and political support. This might require combining elements of different approaches rather than relying on any single policy intervention. It might also require sustained effort over many years rather than expecting quick solutions to problems that developed over centuries. So where does this leave us after examining the history, the arguments, and the evidence? Is reparations for slavery justice or impossibility? The honest answer might be that it's both. The case for reparations rests on a simple moral principle that most Americans would accept in other contexts. When someone is wronged, they deserve compensation. For over 400 years, African Americans were subjected to slavery, legal discrimination, and systematic exclusion from opportunities to build wealth. The effects of these injustices persist today in the form of massive racial wealth gaps and ongoing inequality that affects millions of American families. The case against reparations raises legitimate concerns about implementation, cost, and fairness that can't be dismissed simply because the moral argument is strong. How do you fairly compensate people for historical injustices that affected different families in different ways? How do you design a program that helps those who need it most without creating new forms of unfairness or resentment? How do you build political support for expensive programs in a diverse society where many people feel their own struggles aren't adequately recognized? These practical challenges don't invalidate the moral argument for reparations, but they do suggest that any real-world reparations program would be imperfect and controversial. The gap between moral ideals and political reality is often wide, and that gap is particularly large when it comes to issues involving race and money in American society. Perhaps the most important outcome of the reparations debate isn't whether any specific program is ever implemented, but whether it succeeds in changing how Americans think about racial inequality and government responsibility. The conversation about reparations has already accomplished something significant by forcing the country to confront uncomfortable truths about its history and their ongoing effects. It has moved discussions of racial inequality from the margins to the center of political debate. It has challenged Americans to think seriously about what justice requires and what equality really means. It has made it impossible to ignore the continuing legacy of slavery and discrimination, even for those who oppose reparations as a policy solution. The question isn't just whether America should pay up for the sins of slavery. It's whether America is willing to do the hard work of creating a truly equal society where everyone has genuine opportunities to succeed regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. Reparations might be part of that work, but they won't be the end of it. The real challenge is building a country that lives up to its founding ideals of equality and justice for all. 400 years after the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia, that goal still feels distant. But the growing conversation about reparations suggests that more Americans are ready to grapple seriously with the unfinished business of racial justice. Whether that conversation leads to reparations or other forms of action, it represents a crucial step toward the more perfect union that America has always promised but never fully delivered. The debt may be complicated to calculate and difficult to pay, but